There's a television show called Westworld where the premise is people can visit a theme park in the Wild West. So it's very much a frontier style Western place, and it's completely open world. It goes on for miles and miles. And you can run around the park and explore, and the park is populated by robots who are indistinguishable from humans, both physically and intellectually and consciously. And you can do anything you want in this theme park. So as you're running around, exploring, having fun with your buddies, you can choose to be a bad guy or a good guy. In the show, they call it a black hat or a white hat. Anyone who's played an open world video game will understand this concept. You can play the game as a good guy, a hero, or you can decide to be the villain. And as we reach the year, say, 1870 in this story, for me, it's not a perfect analogy, of course, but it was hard to not think of Westworld as I was learning about two famous explorers of Africa, David Livingstone and Henry Morton Stanley. Now, if we remember from the last episode, Europeans in large measure viewed the interior of the continent of Africa as a dark and primitive place. Central Africa was not a place that Europeans had been to much. But increasingly, as some of the economic and social and political motivations for imperialism that we talked about in the last episode, as those motivations are increasing, public interest in exploring Africa is on the rise during this period. So David Livingstone is one of these famous explorers. He supposedly wanted to discover the source of the Nile River. There was this belief that the source of the Nile would lead people into the interior of Africa, and it would be this incredible discovery. And Livingstone is also a missionary. So as he's exploring, he's trying to convert people to Christianity. He's building relationships with the African people that he's coming into contact with. Most of the histories that you read are going to say that he generally treated these people with respect and in turn was respected himself. And so Livingstone maybe ends up being that white hat character. Obviously, it's more complicated than that, but in Livingstone's mind, he's doing it for the right reasons. But at a certain point in the late 1860s, David Livingstone goes off the map, pun intended. His dispatches are cut off, all communication from him ceases, and people in Europe are worried about what happened to this guy. This is where Henry Morton Stanley comes into the picture. Stanley has a extremely complex background. He's growing up in an orphanage. He's a Civil War veteran in America, maybe a deserter. But he ends up as a newspaper man, and somehow he gets a job at a newspaper basically to go find Livingstone and report on it. In a lot of ways, Stanley reminds you a bit of the modern day TikTok or YouTube celebrities, or sometimes even podcasters, where Stanley is reporting on what he's finding in Africa, but he's also creating a narrative around it, and he's dramatizing it. And he has this sense of honor and a warrior ethos that is characteristic of this time period, and a lot of self-righteousness. So here's an example of something Stanley wrote at the time. He says, quote, "Like a gladiator in the arena, any flinching, any cowardice, and he is lost. The gladiator meets the sword that is sharpened for his bosom. The roving correspondent meets the command that may send him to his doom." End quote. There he's characterizing this mission to go find Livingstone as sort of this titanic clash of good and evil. And again, there's this sort of warrior spirit that he has. But if Livingstone was the white hat in our Westworld analogy, then Henry Morton Stanley was the black hat. On his mission, Stanley brought with him armed guards. He hired local Africans as porters. He brought an interpreter. This expedition force could have been hundreds of people. He's sending back dispatches that are dramatized, and the people in Europe are lapping it up. They want to hear more. He's talking about mystery diseases and animals, gorillas, crocodiles, the Arab slave traders who are going to play a big role in this story, and in particular in Europe were viewed very negatively. But he's also treating his African porters and really everybody on his expedition terribly. He says, quote, "The blacks give an immense amount of trouble. They are too ungrateful to suit my fancy. When mud and wet sapped the physical energy of the lazily inclined, a dog whip became their backs, restoring them to a sound, sometimes to an extravagant activity. The incorrigible deserters were flogged and chained." End quote. I guess Stanley forgot that he himself deserted from the United States Navy, but anyway. He's abusing porters. He's going from village to village and generally treating Africans terribly. We're going to have more on this later, but it's at this point that Stanley finds Livingstone. And according to Stanley's own dispatches, he, in this dramatic moment of months and months of searching and finally reaching Livingstone, he says, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume?" Now, 150 years later, this story of the white hat and the black hat meeting and Stanley finding Livingstone might not seem like the biggest deal, and you might be thinking, how does this relate to the Congo? And again, what's the big deal here? But it's hard to understate the public interest that Stanley's exploration was creating in Europe at the time. And the interest in this story is maybe the first indication in this story that this is going to be maybe the first modern mass media driven and influenced historical narrative. And what I mean by that is that what ends up happening in the Congo and the heroes and villains of this story are duking it out in the hearts and the minds of the public. And in turn, public opinion and mass media are going to influence what goes on in the Congo. So after Stanley's success and the public interest in his finding of Livingstone, he's going to go on another mission from 1874 to 1877. He's going to try to do what many in Europe thought was impossible. He's going to travel from the east coast of Africa by land all the way to the west coast of Africa. Never mind that this has been done before many times by Africans themselves, but anyway. This Trans-Africa expedition is a huge deal in Europe because, remember, to them, Africa and the interior of Africa is viewed as this sort of dark and primitive and unexplored place. And as imperialism is heating up, if there is some way to open up the interior of Africa, this could be enormous. So a lot of people in Europe are watching very closely. The end result of the expedition is that Stanley reaches the west coast of Africa and he reaches the Congo River Basin in 1877. The journey lasted 2 years. It covered 7,000 miles and it involved hundreds, over 1,000 people. At the time, this was really an incredible achievement of exploration. But the way that Stanley treated both his own African porters and guides, and also how he treated the villages and the people in those villages that he came across, is another indicator that a theme of this story is emerging. So we talked about how mass media is going to be a theme. Take a listen to Stanley in his own words, talking about some of the things that he was up to. Quote, "We've attacked and destroyed 28 large towns and 3 or 4 score villages." End quote. In another dispatch, he says, quote, "The beach was crowded with infuriates and mockers. We perceived we were followed by several canoes, in some of which we saw spears shaken at us. I opened on them with the Winchester repeating rifle. 6 shots and 4 deaths were sufficient to quiet the mocking." End quote. Another dispatch, when some of his porters mutinied against him after the horrible treatment they were receiving, he says, quote, "Sentenced to 200 lashes, the 2 drunkards to 100 lashes each, and to be kept in chains for 6 months. They are faithless, lying, thievish, indolent knaves, who only teach a man to despise himself for his folly in attempting a grand work with such miserable slaves." End quote. Now, as Stanley is sending back these reports, and at times, like we just heard there, being fairly blunt with his treatment of Africans, many people in Europe are lapping this up and enjoying the drama and the story of it, but there's many abolitionists and human rights people who are thinking, this is crazy. And Stanley responds to them by basically saying, hey, you guys aren't the ones here. I'm the one here that has to do this, and you guys are just criticizing me safe thousands of miles away. He says, quote, "The howling dervishes of civilization, safe in London, the philanthropist whose impractical view is that a leader should permit his men to be slaughtered by the natives and should be slaughtered himself and let discovery go to the dogs, but should never pull a trigger against this species of human vermin." End quote. So it seems that Stanley in some ways is waging this battle of public opinion against abolitionists and human rights activists. And obviously he's also dealing with the realities on the ground in Africa. And again, he's doing all of this very much in a black hat style where, well, I'll let historian Adam Hochschild summarize this Trans-Africa expedition. Hochschild says, quote, "The explorer was vague and contradictory in his numbers, but the death toll among the expedition's members was overwhelming. Many succumbed to festering wounds, dysentery, smallpox, or typhus, all exacerbated by spells of near starvation. Stanley would not allow porters ill with smallpox to stay behind and convalesce, or even to walk off into the forest to die. He made them carry their loads until they dropped, and he drove himself almost as hard as he did his men. On the journey, he lost more than 60 pounds. Several times, the expedition ran perilously short of water. It endured snake and hippo attacks, spear grass, worms that bored into the soles of porters' feet, and paths that led over knife-sharp rocks. By the time the survivors reached Boma, they were numb with exhaustion, suffering from what today we would call post-traumatic stress syndrome. Several soon died of no apparent cause, waiting to sail home." End quote. At some point on his mission, Stanley made a deal with a Arab slave trader by the name of Tipu Tip, and Tipu Tip was a notorious slave driver in the Arab slave trade in the area, and they decided they would work together. Tipu Tip would help Stanley move to the west part of Africa, and in exchange, Stanley would get protection from Tipu Tip's men, and Tipu Tip would get some of Stanley's guns, which if you read Tipu Tip's accounts are going to be important, and he also gets access to new territory for slaving. And of course, the people of Congo and of the areas that Stanley and Tipu Tip were moving through generally hated and feared this guy. not to mention Stanley now, for the treatment that they were receiving. We do have some very rare African accounts of what was going on with this Tipu and Henry Morton Stanley alliance here. A man born in the Congo by the name of Dasasi Makulo was captured by Tipu and Arab slave traders. He watched as resistance to Tipu was organized and failed, and then he was eventually sold to Henry Morton Stanley. And he provides a rare firsthand account from the African perspective. And in one of his writings, he talks about Stanley's speech that he gives to a bunch of slaves right after he buys them. And this is just the perfect example of the civilizing mission. So you can imagine a scared group of people, not sure what's going to be happening to them as they transition to this new guy, Stanley. And Stanley says, quote, "My children, do not be alarmed. I did not buy you in order to injure you, but in order to give you true happiness and prosperity. You have all seen how the Arabs treated your parents and even little children. I can no longer let you return to your home. I do not want you to become like them, wild and cruel people who do not know the true God. Do not regret losing your parents. I will get you other parents who treat you well and teach you good things, and then you will become like us." End quote. There we have this mix of slavery and religion and this idea that we're going to bring civilization to the peoples of Africa. And again, it's this very nice distillation of the civilizing mission. But in some ways, Stanley may not have been that far off base here. In the accounts that you read here, the number of areas that are completely cleared out with nothing but skulls and the amount of ivory that Tipu was taking from these villages to begin with really highlights the level of disruption that this Afro-Arab slave trade was causing to people in the Congo. So you do get this sense of Tipu and the Afro-Arab slave traders coming in from the east, and of course, the transatlantic slave trade coming in from the west, and the people of the Congo with their own histories and systems of slavery kind of in the middle, and they're the ones who ultimately are going to pay the price. By 1877, Henry Morton Stanley has now completed his journey across Africa, and he's charted the Congo River, which before had never been fully charted by a European. And in the back of his mind, he's probably realizing that you could take steamships on certain parts of this river and they could open up all of Africa to commerce. So there are places in the river called cataracts that are unpassable, but if you were to sail your steamships up the river and then disassemble them, carry them over land for however long those rocky areas last, and then put them together on the other side, you could potentially transport goods and people all up and down the Congo River and thereby gain access to Central Africa. And there is one man in Europe, the King of Belgium, King Leopold II, who is particularly interested in Stanley's observations and his journey and his charting of the Congo River. And this is really where Leopold enters the story here. So, in the grand scheme of history, Leopold II is one of the most infamous villains of all time. In many ways, he is a modern leader in a time period before his age. He understands mass media probably better than any other king at the time. His motivations for wealth and the methods that he ends up being willing to use to achieve those goals they will all seem very modern to us as we go through the story. But by the time 1880 or so rolls around, Leopold had always wanted a colony for Belgium. In the minds of many European monarchs and people in power, having colonies meant that you were a powerful country and you could sit at the table of the great world powers. And right now, Belgium didn't have a colony. Leopold was potentially interested in buying the Philippines. That wasn't for sale. He was looking for some colonies in the New World. Nothing was working out. And finally, basically, Henry Morton Stanley provides Leopold the opportunity because he's paying very close attention to this large area of Africa that's been unexplored prior to this time. And some of the other European leaders aren't as interested in this particular area. But Leopold has a problem because, believe it or not, in 1880 or so, Europeans are past the point where you can just kind of grab a colony. So the days of sailing across an ocean and just planting your flag in the ground and then militarily wiping out anyone who stops you, those days are over. Colonies now have to have a moral backbone. There has to be a reason that you're taking control of this area. And of course, that's what gives us the civilizing mission that we've been talking about. The idea that we're going to spread Christianity and open up free trade and bring civilization to primitive peoples. This is the justification or the motivation that allows Europeans to take what are essentially colonies into the 1900s. Remember that this is a time of Enlightenment values and natural rights and nationalism and, to some extent, self-determination, right? So imperialism and colonialism at face value go against all of these Enlightenment values. So how do you get people to buy into an imperial project from a moral perspective? For Leopold, step one is that this is going to be a scientific pursuit of knowledge. The idea is that they're going to go in and map the interior of Africa for the sake of social and scientific pursuit of knowledge. As a result, Leopold assembles a association, and it ends up being called the International Association of Africa. Leopold brings all these people together, heads of companies and businesses, heads of religion and charities, explorers, and he kind of holds this international conference that becomes this association, and it's going to be this national effort to lift Africa out of darkness, and it's going to be in the name of progress and religion, and it all sounds very noble. Here is King Leopold II's opening speech at this first meeting of the International African Association. He says, quote, "To open to civilization the only part of our globe which it has not yet penetrated, to pierce the darkness which hangs over entire peoples is, I dare say, a crusade worthy of this century of progress. It seemed to me that Belgium, a centrally located and neutral country, would be a suitable place for such a meeting. Need I say in that bringing you to Brussels, I was guided by no egotism? No, gentlemen, Belgium may be a small country, but she is happy and satisfied with her fate. I have no other ambition than to serve her well." End quote. Step one for Leopold in acquiring this colony is now complete. Couch his ambitions in this noble and morally good rhetoric. Make it about science and progress and religion. But behind the scenes, Leopold has other ambitions, obviously. So Leopold wants to hire Henry Morton Stanley, and he wants to have him explore specifically for this International African Association, which again is essentially chaired by Leopold. And he wants to have him go acquire land and make treaties with the natives, again, in the name of this supposedly noble association. In a very famous quote, Leopold supposedly says, quote, "If we like Stanley, we'll give him money to explore in full detail the countries bordering the Congo that he would designate to us. According to the reports of the agents that Stanley had sent there and the influence they would manage to acquire, we will judge what we could do and what kind of position that we could offer to the great traveler, who I dream of making the Belgian Gordon Pasha. Grendel told me about an idea you gave him for the Congo. It is something of this kind that I would like to try. If the English do not prevent our efforts by seizing all Central Africa, we must be cautious, clever, and quick to act. I would not expose myself to displeasing the English or letting escape a good opportunity to get some of this beautiful African cake." End quote. Sometimes you'll see that quote as saying a beautiful slice of the magnificent African cake. Now, at this stage of the game, it's really ivory that Leopold is after. Ivory is a material found in great quantities in Africa. It can come from elephant tusks or sometimes other animals, but it can be used in all kinds of different things like piano keys or jewelry, sculptures, trinkets, these types of things. Extremely popular in Europe. And Leopold, at this stage, hires Henry Morton Stanley, and he sends him on a mission to follow the Congo River, go into the central Congo, and start making treaties with local African chiefs, start collecting ivory, and basically start claiming land for this committee that Leopold has created. And meanwhile, Leopold's busy creating other committees. So he has the Committee for Studies of the Upper Congo, which he secretly holds shares of. And then he heads up another association. This one's called the International Association of the Congo. And this is where I think he's a very modern leader, because he's doing all of this intentionally. And you might be confused where you're thinking, okay, there's the International Association of the Congo, there's the International African Association, there's the Committee for Studies of the Upper Congo. What is going on here? And that confusion is intentional. So he's making all these things sound exactly the same, and he's creating confusion about what is what. So the International African Association is what we just talked about, where he's bringing all these explorers and scientists and statesmen together to further knowledge and progress. But the International Association of the Congo is basically just Leopold's organization. But his plan, and eventually what happens, is he lets the International Association of Africa kind of just die out. And he eventually sort of transitions everything to the International Association of the Congo. So he's going to pull a switcheroo here. He's flying the flag of the International African Association for all of these different areas that Stanley's going to take over. And he's writing editorials in the London Times, and he's hiring newspaper people to talk about setting Africa free from slavery and building hospitals. And what he's really doing is he's laying a public opinion foundation, and he's laying a legal and moral public opinion-based framework for everything that he's about to do. And so from 1879 to 1884, Henry Morton Stanley goes on an exploratory mission that is infamous in world history. And it's very similar to the two missions we saw before, but this time it's supercharged. He takes over 1,000 men. He brings some guns. He assembles steamships to get into the central Congo. And through extreme coercion, he ends up making over 450 treaties with local villages and the people of Congo. And it's important to note that in this colonial imperial world, everything has to have a legal framework, right? So the treaty is supposedly the highest law of the colonial land. And if something is written in a treaty, that makes it true. But the sad and really horrible part of all this is that nobody in the Congo has seen writing before, much less European writing. So they didn't know what a treaty was. They weren't familiar with 300 years of colonial legal framework. And they basically, from the European perspective, unknowingly give away their land. And they also agree to be free labor for anything that these Congo associations want them to do. Here's an example of one of the treaties that Stanley has some of these African village chiefs sign. And they're signing over to the International Association of the Congo, which is Leopold's personal organization. The chiefs of these areas agree to, quote, "We shall keep all roads passing through our district free of duty, tax, or impost to all strangers, white or black, who shall have the recommendation or goodwill of the Association Internationale Africaine. We surrender all right to collect taxes or imposts to the agents of the said association. We agree to recognize the sovereignty of said association and adopt the flag of the association, blue with a golden star as a sign thereof. We shall refer to the said association all matters relating to the government, all questions affecting the peace of the country, all troubles between ourselves and our neighbors, or between ourselves and strangers of any color or nationality, to the arbitration and decision of the agent of the Association Internationale Africa. We declare that we have not made any agreement, oral or written, with any person that would render this agreement null and void in any particular. We declare that from henceforth we and our successors and subjects shall abide by the decision of the chief agent of the Association Internationale Africa in all matters affecting our welfare, our possessions, and our relations to our neighbors or strangers of any color, and that we shall not act contrary to the spirit of this agreement in any particular, on pain of forfeiting all subsidies, gifts, or presents made to us by the agents of the association. In witness whereof we have set our confidential servants as our proxies to sign this agreement, having understood its contents and given our consent verbally in presence of our people to do and act precisely as the chiefs have already done." End quote. And you can see two X's where the African chiefs, quote unquote, signed the paper. Another example of a treaty says that, according to Adam Hochschild, in return for, quote, "one piece of cloth per month to each of the undersigned chiefs, besides present cloth in hand," end quote, the chiefs of Africa, in exchange for that one piece of cloth per month, would promise to give over, quote, "freely of their own accord, for themselves and their heirs and successors forever, give up to the said association the sovereignty and all sovereign and governing rights to all their territories, and to assist by labor or otherwise any works, improvements, or expeditions which the said association shall cause at any time to be carried out in any part of these territories, all roads and waterways running through this country, the right of collecting tolls on the same, and all game, fishing, mining, and forest rights are to be the absolute party of the said association." End quote. That right there is a very legalistic way to essentially legalize slavery and force people from a legal perspective in that territory to work for you, give their labor, and give up their lands and their sovereignty and their freedom in exchange for a piece of cloth. Again, the African chiefs couldn't read what they were signing, and they probably thought they were signing a treaty of friendship, which makes it even more tragic. Historian David Van Rybrock says, quote, "They were written without exception in French or English, languages the chieftains did not understand. Within an oral tradition, in which important agreements were sealed with blood brotherhood, the chiefs often did not understand the import of the cross they made at the bottom of a page filled with strange squiggles. And even if they had been able to read the text, they would not have been familiar with concepts of European property and constitutional law, like sovereignty, exclusivity, perpetuity. They probably thought they were confirming ties of friendships. But those treaties did very much indeed stipulate that they, as chieftain, surrendered all their territory, along with all subordinate rights to paths, fishing, toll-keeping, and trade. In exchange for that cross, the chieftains received from their new white friends bales of cloth, crates of gin, military coats, caps, knives, a livery uniform, or a coral necklace. From now on, the banner of Leopold's association would fly over their village, a blue field with a yellow star. The blue referred to the darkness in which they wandered, the yellow to the light of civilization that was now coming their way. Those are the dominant colors in the Congolese flag even today. End quote. That last sentence there is interesting. You don't want to be too heavy-handed, but this idea of resource extraction is going to be another huge theme in this story. And it's something that, as David Van Rybroek says right there, continues to be a theme even into the modern day, and how a lot of the Congo's resources even today are being exploited by international corporations or foreign countries. At any rate, step 2 in Leopold's plan to acquire a colony is well underway and it's working. So step 1 was to create this association for the philanthropy of Africa and kind of make this whole thing be about progress and civilization. Step 2 was to actually go out and acquire the territory, get the treaties, and establish some legal and moral framework. But step 3 is maybe the most tricky. And what he has to do now is he has to get international recognition for his association of the Congo. Leopold is paying journalists to shill for the Congo and this idea that he's going to create this haven of goodness in the center of Africa. But a lot of the European countries are not really that interested in just giving Leopold a colony. So Leopold turns to an unlikely country at this time. He turns to the United States of America. He's got a guy on the payroll by the name of Henry Sanford. And this guy is a lobbyist who has influence with President MacArthur at the time. Eventually, President MacArthur gives a State of the Union address where he talks about the Congo. Quote, "The rich and populous valley of the Congo is being opened to commerce by a society called the International African Association, of which the King of the Belgians is the president and a citizen of the United States the chief executive officer. Large tracts of the territory have been ceded to the association by native chiefs. Roads have been opened, steamboats placed on the river, and the nuclei of states established at 22 stations under one flag, which offers freedom to commerce and prohibits the slave trade. The objects of the society are philanthropic. It does not aim at a permanent political control, but seeks the neutrality of the valley. The United States cannot be indifferent to this work, nor to the interest of their citizens involved in it. It may become advisable for us to cooperate with other commercial powers in promoting the rights of trade and residents in the Congo Valley, free from the interference or control of any one nation." End quote. Later on, the United States Secretary of State will give a similar endorsement to King Leopold, but in this one, he literally mixes up the names of the International Association of Africa, again, the philanthropic organization, and the International Association of the Congo, which is Leopold's personal organization. So Leopold, whenever possible, is going to switch the names of those two things, and he's going to change the documents to say the International Association of the Congo, which is his personal organization. And so a lot of people in the United States and eventually people at what's called the Berlin Conference don't necessarily realize that they're ceding the rights to this giant tract of territory, not to some philanthropic organization, but to Leopold's private colony. Here is that document from the United States Secretary of State, by the way, where he mixes up the two associations in the same sentence. Quote, "The government of the United States announces its sympathy with and approval of the humane and benevolent purposes of the International Association of the Congo, administering as it does the interests of the free states there established, and will order the officers of the United States, both on land and sea, to recognize the flag of the International African Association as the flag of a friendly government." End quote. Now Leopold has step 3 in his acquire a colony plan completed. He has some level of international recognition, not just for his philanthropy organization, but for his own personal colony. But the last stage of the plan is maybe the trickiest, and it's going to happen at the 1884 Berlin Conference. And this is a famous event in world history. At this point, most of the great European powers were really competing for territory, commerce rights, and resources in Africa. This period in history is called African imperialism, or the scramble for Africa. And a lot of people mistakenly think that the Berlin Conference was like that quote we cited earlier of Leopold. They think the Berlin Conference is slicing up the cake of Africa and just dividing it up and giving it to different countries. Now, in the long run, it kind of ends up being that, but the goals of the Berlin Conference were to open up Africa for quote-unquote civilization and free trade, and to come up with a set of international agreements or to set the rules of conduct in Africa. So it was more about recognizing claims to different areas and resolving disputes about those claims than it was to just simply dividing up all of Africa. It's probably better understood as a rubber stamp of what was already going on, rather than some new event where all of a sudden African imperialism emerges out of this conference. The master of ceremonies at the Berlin Conference is a guy by the name of Otto von Bismarck. He's the leader of Germany, and he's historically known as sort of this great statesman who's trying to maintain a balance of power because he realizes that any imbalance in the great powers of Europe could lead to a major war. And that's exactly what happens later with World War I. But at this stage, Otto von Bismarck realizes that Leopold II is slimy and he's up to no good here, but he also doesn't want a major war to break out between Britain and France or between Germany and France. And he's concerned that if he doesn't give legitimacy to Belgium's claim for the Congo, it could lead to a larger conflict between the other great powers. So Leopold very wisely uses this to his advantage, and he promises that the Congo is going to be an area of free trade, and they're going to end the slavery there. And this sounds good to some of the other countries because maybe some are worried about Britain becoming too powerful in Africa, or maybe some are worried about France becoming too powerful. So why not just give this area to tiny little Belgium, who's not a threat to anybody? Now, there are some twists and turns here, but the end result of the Berlin Conference is that King Leopold II of Belgium finally has his colony, and it is his colony. The territory is ceded over to his associations. Again, there's a lot of confusion. Some people are calling it the International African Association. Some people are calling it the International Association of the Congo. Leopold's going to allow that philanthropic organization to essentially dissolve, and that basically goes away forever. And he is going to rename the International Association of Congo the Congo Free State. So after all of the tricks and the behind-the-scenes maneuvering and the public relations maneuvers and the quest to get international recognition and the alliances and the treaties with Stanley, King Leopold II, not even the state of Belgium, but King Leopold II himself, has his own personal colony in Africa, the Congo Free State. And for the people of the Congo, the nightmare was only just beginning. If you enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe on Patreon for bonus episodes, video essays, behind-the-scenes content, and other perks. You can also join the Patreon for free to get a monthly recommendations email and a sneak peek at what's up next. You can support in other ways by subscribing and leaving a rating or review in your podcast app, by following on social media, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, etc., by sharing with a friend, or simply by continuing to listen. You can also sign up for my email newsletter, which has some written pieces and podcast updates every now and then. Links to all of this stuff are in the show notes. Any comments or suggestions you can send to reflectinghistory@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. That's it for now.